The wind cut through Juliana Morgan's threadbare dress like 1,000 razor blades, but she had stopped feeling the cold hours ago. She stood on the auction platform in Fort Smith, Arkansas, her bare feet numb against the frozen wood, watching her breath form clouds in the bitter December air of 1876, as men with calloused hands and calculating eyes assessed her worth like she was livestock. Her father's debts had brought her here. 3 weeks ago, Samuel Morgan had died owing money to half the territory, leaving his 19-year-old daughter as the only asset his creditors could claim. The law might have called it indentured servitude, but Juliana knew what it really was. She was being sold, plain and simple, on the coldest day of winter Fort Smith had seen in 20 years. The auctioneer, a portly man named Henderson with tobacco-stained teeth, grabbed her arm and yanked her forward. "Fresh young woman, healthy and strong, can cook, clean, and work a garden. Starting bid is $200. Juliana kept her eyes fixed on the horizon beyond the crowd, refusing to meet their gazes. She would not cry. She would not give them that satisfaction. Her dark hair whipped around her face as the wind picked up, and she could see snow clouds gathering in the distance. The temperature had been dropping all morning, and now it felt like the very air might freeze solid. Men shouted numbers at Henderson. 200, 250, 300. She recognized some of them from town. Old Pete Rawlings, who had buried 3 wives already, each one younger than the last. Marcus Gibbs, who ran the saloon and had a reputation for cruelty. Dutch Van Horn, who owned the largest ranch in the county and treated his workers worse than his cattle. 350, Dutch called out, his cruel smile showing missing teeth. Juliana's stomach turned. She had heard stories about the Van Horn Ranch, about workers who disappeared, about women who went there and were never seen in town again. Her hands trembled, but she clenched them into fists, forcing herself to stand straight. If this was to be her fate, she would face it with whatever dignity remained to her. 400, Marcus Gibbs countered. Henderson's eyes gleamed with greed. 400, do I hear 450? The crowd had grown silent, the bidding getting too rich for most of their blood. Juliana scanned the faces below her, seeing hunger and avarice reflected back. Then her eyes caught on a man standing at the edge of the crowd, and something about him made her pause. He was tall, perhaps 24 or 25, with dark hair that touched his collar and eyes the color of storm clouds. He wore a heavy coat and a worn hat, and unlike the other men, he was not looking at her with calculation or lust. Instead, his expression was troubled, almost angry, though not at her. His jaw was set tight and his hands were clenched at his sides. 450, Dutch shouted, breaking her concentration. 500, Marcus countered immediately. Henderson was practically dancing now. $500, an excellent price. Do I hear 550? Dutch hesitated, clearly reaching his limit. Marcus grinned victoriously, already counting his purchase as won. Juliana felt her heart sink. Of all the men here, Marcus Gibbs was perhaps the worst. She had seen what he did to the girls who worked in his saloon, had heard their quiet sobs late at night when she walked past on her way home from the seamstress shop where she used to work. The tall stranger at the edge of the crowd shifted, and Juliana saw him reach into his coat pocket. He pulled out a leather wallet and stood there for a long moment, staring at it. His jaw worked, and she could see some internal struggle playing out across his features. "Going once," Henderson called. The stranger's eyes lifted and met Juliana's across the crowd. Something passed between them in that moment, something she could not name. His gray eyes held hers, and she saw the anger there again, but also something else. Compassion, perhaps, or maybe just common human decency, which felt in short supply in Fort Smith these days. Going twice. The stranger closed his eyes briefly, as if making a decision that pained him. Then he opened them, stepped forward through the crowd, and raised his hand. $1,000, he called out, his voice deep and steady. The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs. Henderson's eyes went wide. Marcus Gibbs spun around to stare at the stranger with undisguised fury. Dutch Van Horn cursed under his breath and spat in the snow. 1,000, Henderson repeated, his voice cracking with excitement. Do I hear 1,100? 1,100! The crowd had gone silent. $1,000 was more money than most men in Fort Smith saw in 2 years. Marcus glared at the stranger for a long moment, then shook his head and stalked away, his face red with anger. Dutch turned and left without another word. Going once, going twice, sold. Henderson brought down his gavel. Sold to the gentleman in the back for $1,000. Juliana felt her knees go weak. She did not know whether to feel relieved or terrified. The stranger made his way through the crowd toward the platform, pulling bills from his wallet. Up close, she could see the weariness in his face, the lines around his eyes that spoke of hard work and harder choices. He wore dusty trail clothes beneath his coat, and his boots were worn but well-maintained. He counted out the money into Henderson's eager hands without a word, then signed the papers that made Juliana Morgan his legal property for the next 7 years, the length of her father's debts. When it was done, Henderson handed him the contract and practically shoved Juliana toward him. She stumbled on the steps leading down from the platform, her numb feet unable to find purchase. The stranger caught her elbow, steadying her with surprising gentleness. "Easy," he said quietly. "Can you walk?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. He released her arm and shrugged out of his heavy coat, draping it around her shoulders. The warmth of it was shocking after hours in the freezing wind, and she could not help the small sound of relief that escaped her throat. "Thank you," she managed to whisper. He did not respond, just gestured for her to follow him. They walked through the dispersing crowd, and Juliana felt dozens of eyes on them. The stranger led her to a hitching post where a handsome bay gelding stood waiting, its breath steaming in the cold air. He untied the horse and turned to face her. For a moment he just looked at her, and she looked back, trying to read his intentions in his face. He had kind eyes, she decided, despite the hardness around them, or at least not cruel ones. "What is your name?" he asked finally. "Juliana Morgan," she said. "What is yours?" "Joshua Zimmerman," he replied. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a pair of worn riding gloves. "Here, your hands are freezing." She took them automatically, sliding them onto her hands. They were too large, but they were warm, and that was all that mattered. Joshua looked down at the papers in his hand, at the contract that bound Juliana to him for 7 years. His jaw tightened again, and then, to her complete shock, he tore the papers in half. "What are you doing?" she gasped. He tore them again and again until the contract was nothing but scraps. Then he let them fall into the snow at their feet. "Now you belong to yourself," he said quietly. Juliana stared at him, unable to comprehend what had just happened. "I do not understand." "Those papers said you were my property," Joshua said, his voice flat. "I just paid $1,000 that I do not have to spare for the right to free you, so I am freeing you. You can go wherever you want. Do whatever you want. You are your own woman now." She looked down at the torn pieces of paper scattered in the snow, then back up at his face. "You spent $1,000 just to set me free?" "Yes." "Why?" Joshua was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Because it was wrong, all of it. What they did to you, what that crowd was willing to do, the whole damned system that allows it." He shook his head. "I grew up watching my mother be bought and sold by the men in her life. watched her lose herself piece by piece until there was nothing left. I swore when she died that if I ever had the chance to save someone from that fate, I would. So that is what I am doing." Juliana felt tears prick her eyes, the first she had allowed herself all day. "I have nowhere to go," she said softly. "No family, no money. In this cold, I will die before nightfall." Joshua looked up at the darkening sky, at the snow clouds that were now directly overhead. His expression was troubled. "I have a ranch about 10 miles north of here. Nothing fancy, just a small spread with a cabin and a barn. You could stay there, at least until the weather breaks and you can figure out what you want to do next." He met her eyes. "As my guest, not my property. You would have your own room. I would not touch you or make demands of you. When spring comes, if you want to leave, I will give you money for the stage and you can go wherever you want." It was perhaps the most generous offer anyone had ever made her, and yet Juliana found herself hesitating. She did not know this man. For all his pretty words about freedom, he could be lying. He could get her to his ranch and do whatever he wanted with her, and no one would ever know or care. But then again, what choice did she have? If she stayed in Fort Smith, Marcus Gibbs or Dutch Van Horn would find her. They would make her pay for costing them money and embarrassment. And in this cold, without shelter or supplies, she would freeze to death long before she found another option. Joshua seemed to sense her hesitation. "I give you my word, Miss Morgan, you will be safe with me. I will not harm you or force you to do anything you do not want to do." She studied his face, searching for any sign of deception. All she saw was sincerity and a bone-deep weariness that matched her own. "All right," she said finally. "I will come with you." He nodded and pulled a blanket from his saddlebag. "We need to ride double. The horse can manage it for 10 miles. I will lift you up first." Before she could respond, he put his hands around her waist and lifted her onto the saddle as easily as if she weighed nothing. Then he swung up behind her, his arms coming around her to take the reins. She stiffened at the contact, but he shifted back as much as he could, keeping his body from pressing against hers. "Wrap that blanket around yourself," he said. "It is going to be a cold ride." They set off through the streets of Fort Smith, and Juliana looked back once at the auction platform, at the place where her life had nearly ended. Then she turned forward, tucking herself into Joshua's coat and the blanket, and tried not to think about what the future might hold. The snow started falling before they reached the edge of town. Within minutes, it was coming down in thick, heavy flakes that reduced visibility to just a few yards. Joshua urged the horse into a faster pace, but the animal could only do so much carrying 2 riders through deepening snow. "How much further?" Juliana called over the wind. 8 miles, maybe," Joshua called back. "We will make it." But his voice held doubt, and Juliana felt fear curl in her stomach. She had lived in Arkansas her entire life, had seen winter storms before. This was shaping up to be a bad one, the kind that killed travelers caught unprepared. They rode on through the blizzard, and Juliana lost all sense of time and direction. Everything was white, the world reduced to the rhythm of the horses' hooves and the sound of wind howling around them. She started to shiver uncontrollably despite the coat and blanket, and she felt Joshua's arms tighten slightly around her. "Stay with me," he said into her ear. "We are almost there." She did not believe him, but she nodded anyway. Her feet had gone from numb to burning to numb again, and she could not feel her face anymore. The cold was seeping into her bones, making her drowsy. She knew that was dangerous, knew that falling asleep in this cold could mean never waking up, but it was getting harder and harder to keep her eyes open. "Juliana." Joshua's voice was sharp. "Stay awake." "I am trying," she mumbled. "Talk to me. Tell me about yourself. Anything." She tried to think through the fog in her mind. There is not much to tell. I am 19. My mother died when I was 12. My father worked as a clerk until he started drinking. Then he just worked at drinking until it killed him. No siblings, a brother, Thomas. He died of fever 5 years ago. She paused. I worked as a seamstress until my father's debts came due. What about you? 25. Born in Missouri, but I have been in Arkansas for 3 years. Bought my ranch with money I saved from working cattle drives. His voice was steady, cutting through the wind. My father died when I was young. My mother remarried badly. That is where I learned what I know about cruel men and the women who suffer under them. Is she still alive? No, she died when I was 18. That is when I left and came west. Juliana wanted to ask more, but another wave of drowsiness washed over her. She felt herself starting to slump, but Joshua shifted his arm, propping her up against him. There, he said suddenly. I can see the barn. She forced her eyes open and saw a dark shape looming through the white curtain of snow. Joshua guided the horse toward it, and soon they were in the lee of a building. The wind suddenly cut to almost nothing. Joshua dismounted and reached up for her. Come on, I have got you. She tried to swing her leg over the saddle, but her body would not cooperate. Joshua simply lifted her down, then half carried her toward a cabin she could barely see through the snow. He kicked open the door and brought her inside, setting her down in a chair near a cold fireplace. I need to get the horse settled, he said. Do not move. I will be right back. He was gone before she could respond, the door closing behind him and plunging the cabin into near darkness. Juliana sat in the chair, shaking so hard her teeth rattled, and looked around what she could see of her new surroundings. The cabin was small but well built, just one main room with a fireplace, a stove, a table with 2 chairs, and a bed in one corner. A ladder led up to what must be a loft, and 2 doors on the far wall probably led to a bedroom and storage room. Everything was neat and clean, the mark of a man who lived alone and took care of his space. The door opened again, bringing in a blast of cold air and Joshua, his hat and shoulders covered in snow. He went immediately to the fireplace and began building a fire with practiced efficiency. Within minutes, flames were crackling and blessed warmth began to spread through the room. We need to get you out of those wet clothes, Joshua said, standing up. You are going to catch your death. He went to one of the doors and opened it, rummaging around inside. He emerged with an armful of clothes. These are mine, so they will be too big, but they are warm and dry. Can you manage on your own, or do you need help? Juliana tried to stand and nearly fell. Her legs would not hold her weight. Joshua caught her and steadied her, his face creased with concern. Your feet are frostbitten, he said, looking down at her bare, blackened toes. This is bad, Juliana. I need to get you warm now. I can change myself, she said through chattering teeth. No, you cannot. You can barely stand. He looked deeply uncomfortable. I am going to help you, but I give you my word I will be nothing but professional about it. All right. She nodded, too cold and exhausted to argue. Joshua helped her out of the wet dress, averting his eyes as much as possible, and into a thick flannel shirt and wool pants. He had to roll the sleeves and pant legs several times, but when he was done, she was covered from neck to ankle in warm, dry fabric. Better? He asked. Yes, thank you. He carried her to the bed and set her down, then pulled several quilts from a chest and piled them on top of her. I need to check your feet, he said. This is going to hurt. He was not wrong. As he gently examined her toes, pain shot up her legs like lightning. She bit her lip to keep from crying out, but tears leaked from her eyes anyway. The skin is not broken, which is good, Joshua said. But you have significant frostbite. I need to rewarm them, but it has to be done slowly. Too fast and you could lose the toes. He went to the stove and put a pot of water on to heat, then brought a basin over to the bed. For the next hour, he carefully tended to her feet, warming them gradually with increasingly warm water. Juliana clenched her fists in the quilts and fought not to scream as sensation returned in waves of agony. "I know it hurts," Joshua said quietly, his hands steady and gentle. "But the pain is good. It means the tissue is alive and healing." When he was finally satisfied, he dried her feet carefully and wrapped them in clean bandages. Then he added more wood to the fire and began making coffee on the stove. "I will make us something to eat," he said. "You should rest." "Where will you sleep?" Juliana asked, looking around the one-room cabin. "The loft," Joshua said, nodding upward. "There is a cot up there, you take the bed." "But this is your home, I cannot take your bed." "You can and you will," he said firmly. "You have had a hell of a day, Miss Morgan. Take what comfort I can offer." She was too exhausted to argue further. She lay back against the pillows and watched him move around the small cabin, making coffee and preparing a simple meal of beans and cornbread. The fire crackled and popped and the wind howled outside, but inside the cabin it was warm and safe. "Why did you really buy me?" she asked after a long silence. Joshua paused in his work, his back to her. "I told you because it was wrong. But $1,000. That is everything you have, is it not? Close enough." He turned to face her. "I had been saving for 3 years to buy more land to expand the ranch. That money was my future, my security." He shrugged. "But what good is a future built on watching injustice and doing nothing to stop it?" "Most men would not see it that way." "I am not most men." He poured coffee into 2 tin cups and brought one over to her. "My mother spent her whole life under the thumbs of men who thought they owned her. First my father, who drank and hit her. Then my stepfather, who was worse. By the time I was old enough to protect her, there was nothing left of her to protect. She was just a shell." His voice was thick with old pain. "When she died, I promised myself I would never stand by and watch it happen to someone else. So when I saw you up on that platform today, saw the fear in your eyes and the way those men were looking at you, I knew I had to do something." Juliana felt her throat tighten with emotion. "You gave up your dreams for a stranger. I can always save more money, buy land later. But I could not live with myself if I let you be sold to someone like Marcus Gibbs or Dutch Van Horn." He met her eyes. "You matter, Juliana Morgan. Your life matters. Your freedom matters, even if no one else in Fort Smith thinks so." A tear slipped down her cheek. "I do not know how to thank you." "You do not need to thank me. Just live. Build a good life for yourself. That will be thanks enough." They ate in companionable silence, and Juliana felt some of her strength returning with the food and warmth. When they were done, Joshua cleaned up the dishes and banked the fire. "I will be in the loft if you need anything," he said. "Try to sleep." "Joshua," she called as he started up the ladder. He paused and looked down at her. "You are a good man, better than you know." Something crossed his face, something that looked almost like pain. "Get some rest, Juliana." He disappeared into the loft, and Juliana burrowed deeper under the quilts. The bed smelled like him, like leather and wood smoke and something distinctly masculine. It was not an unpleasant smell. She listened to the sounds of him settling in above her, and for the first time in weeks, she felt safe. Outside, the blizzard raged on, burying Fort Smith under feet of snow. But inside the cabin, Juliana drifted off to sleep with a full stomach and warm feet, and dreamed of torn paper falling like snow and gray eyes that looked at her with kindness. She woke to the smell of bacon frying and sunlight streaming through the cabin's small windows. The blizzard had passed, leaving the world outside covered in a thick blanket of pristine white. Juliana sat up slowly, wincing at the soreness in her feet and the ache in her muscles. Joshua was at the stove, his back to her, cooking breakfast. He had shed his coat and was dressed in work clothes, his dark hair still mussed from sleep. "Good morning," she said, her voice still rough. He turned and gave her a small smile. "Morning. How are your feet?" "Better, I think, still sore." "That is normal. Let me check them after breakfast." He plated the bacon and added eggs to the pan. "How did you sleep?" "Well, actually, better than I have in weeks." She pushed back the quilts and tried to stand, testing her feet gingerly. They held her weight, though walking was painful. "Take it easy," Joshua said, watching her with concern. "You do not need to push yourself. I cannot just lie in bed all day." "Why not? You have been through an ordeal. You are allowed to rest." But Juliana had never been good at resting. She made her way over to the table and sat down, looking around the cabin properly for the first time. In the daylight, she could see it more clearly. The main room was sparsely furnished but clean and well kept. Books lined a shelf near the bed, and a rifle hung over the fireplace. Through the window, she could see a barn and several outbuildings, all nearly buried in snow. Joshua brought over 2 plates of food and sat down across from her. "The snow is deep. We are probably snowed in for at least a few days." "I am sorry," Juliana said. "You must have work to do, and now you are stuck here with an invalid taking up your time." "I have to feed the animals, but that is about all I can manage in this snow anyway. And you are not an invalid, you are a guest." He took a bite of eggs. "Besides, I am not in a hurry to get back to town. After what I did yesterday, I am probably not too popular." "What do you mean?" "I humiliated Marcus Gibbs and Dutch Van Horn in front of half the town. Those are not men who forget slights easily. They will be looking for ways to get back at me." He shrugged. "It was worth it, but there will be consequences." Juliana felt guilt twist in her stomach. "I have brought trouble to your door." "No, I brought trouble to my own door by doing what I knew was right. That is on me, not you." He reached across the table and touched her hand briefly. "Stop trying to make this your fault. You did not ask to be sold. You did not create the circumstances that brought you to that platform. You were a victim, and I chose to help. End of story." She looked down at her plate, blinking back tears. "I am not used to people being kind to me." "Then maybe it is time you got used to it." They ate in silence for a few minutes, and then Juliana asked, "What happens now?" Now you heal. Now you rest. Now you figure out what you want to do with your freedom." Joshua leaned back in his chair. "I meant what I said yesterday. You can stay here as long as you need to, and when you are ready to leave, I will make sure you have the means to go wherever you want." "And if I want to stay?" The question surprised them both. Joshua looked at her with raised eyebrows. "Here at the ranch, I could work," Juliana said quickly. "Earn my keep. I am a good cook, and I know how to clean and mend clothes and tend a garden. I would not be a burden." Joshua shook his head. "You would not be working off a debt, Juliana. That would just be another form of servitude. But I want to. I want to have a purpose, to be useful. Sitting idle while you provide for me makes me feel like a kept woman." She met his eyes. "Please, let me contribute, not because I owe you, but because I choose to." He studied her for a long moment. "All right," he said finally, "if that is what you want. But the moment it feels like an obligation instead of a choice, you tell me. Deal, deal." They shook on it, and Juliana felt something ease in her chest. She had a place to stay, work to do, and a man who respected her enough to let her make her own choices. It was more than she had ever hoped for. Over the next few days, they fell into an easy routine. Joshua tended the animals and kept the paths shoveled while Juliana took over the cooking and cleaning. Her feet healed slowly, the pain lessening each day until she could walk without limping. They talked while they worked, sharing stories and slowly getting to know each other. Juliana learned that Joshua had been on his own since he was 18. that he had worked as a ranch hand and a trail driver before saving enough to buy his own land. He was quiet and serious, but he had a dry sense of humor that emerged at unexpected moments. Joshua learned that Juliana loved to read, that she had once dreamed of being a teacher before her father's drinking destroyed those plans. She was stronger than she looked, both physically and emotionally, with a resilience that came from surviving hard circumstances. One evening, about a week after the blizzard, they sat by the fire after dinner, Joshua reading while Juliana mended one of his shirts. The cabin was warm and cozy, and outside the wind howled through the bare trees. "Can I ask you something?" Juliana said, breaking the comfortable silence. Joshua looked up from his book. "Of course. You regret it. Spending all that money on me." He was quiet for a moment, considering. "No," he said finally. "I do not regret it. The money was just money. What you gained was your freedom, and that is priceless. But now you cannot expand your ranch. Your dreams are delayed, maybe for years. Dreams can wait. You could not." He set down his book and looked at her seriously. "Juliana, I need you to understand something. What happened to you was not right. The fact that the law allowed it does not make it moral. Someone needed to stand up and say so, and that day it was me. I would do it again in a heartbeat." She felt her eyes sting with tears. "How are you real?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, how does a man like you exist in a world full of men like Marcus Gibbs and Dutch Van Horn?" She set down the shirt. "You are kind and decent, and you see women as people, not property. Where did you come from?" Joshua looked away into the fire. "I came from the same place as men like Marcus and Dutch. I saw the same things they saw. The difference is, I chose to learn from the pain instead of perpetuating it." He turned back to her. "My stepfather used to beat my mother. I would lie in bed at night and listen to her cry, and I would think about all the things I would do to him when I got big enough. But by the time I was big enough, my mother was already broken. And when I finally did confront him, do you know what he said?" Juliana shook her head. "He said she was his property, that he had every right to treat her however he wanted. He said that was just how the world worked." Joshua's jaw tightened. "Right then, I decided that if that was how the world worked, the world was wrong, and I would spend the rest of my life trying to prove it." Juliana felt something shift inside her chest, something warm and unfamiliar. She had known Joshua was a good man, but hearing him speak with such passion about justice and dignity made her see him in a new light. He was not just good, he was extraordinary. And he had saved her not out of pity or obligation, but out of genuine conviction. "Thank you," she said softly, "for being who you are." Their eyes met across the firelight, and something passed between them, something electric and undeniable. Joshua looked away first, clearing his throat. "It is getting late," he said, standing up. "I should let you get some sleep." "Joshua," she called as he headed for the ladder. He paused. "I am glad it was you that day at the auction. I am glad it was you who bought me." He nodded slowly. "So am I. Good night, Juliana. Good night." As she lay in bed that night, Juliana realized with a start that she was happy. Despite everything that had happened, despite the uncertainty of her future, she was genuinely happy. For the first time in years, she felt safe and valued and cared for. And it was all because of the man sleeping in the loft above her, the man she was starting to have feelings for. The realization should have terrified her. She had known Joshua less than 2 weeks. She was living in his home, dependent on his generosity. Developing feelings for him complicated everything, put her in a vulnerable position. But as she lay there listening to the sound of him breathing above her, she could not deny what she felt. It was more than gratitude, more than appreciation. It was something deeper, something that made her heart race when he smiled at her, that made her hyper-aware of every accidental touch, every shared glance. She was falling for Joshua Zimmerman, and she had no idea what to do about it. The next morning, Juliana tried to act normal, but she felt awkward and self-conscious around Joshua in a way she had not before. He seemed to notice something was off but did not press her about it, which she appreciated. After breakfast, Joshua announced he needed to ride into town for supplies. "The weather has cleared enough that the roads should be passable," he said. "I will be back by evening." "Can I come with you?" Juliana asked before she could stop herself. Joshua looked uncertain. "Are you sure that is a good idea? Gibbs and Van Horn might be in town." "I cannot hide here forever. Besides, I need some things. Clothes that fit, for one." She gestured at the oversized shirt and pants she was wearing. Joshua hesitated, then nodded. "All right, but you stay close to me, understood?" "Understood." They saddled the horse and rode into Fort Smith together, Joshua's arm around her waist to keep her steady. Juliana tried to ignore how good it felt to be held by him, how right it seemed. Fort Smith was still partially buried in snow, but the main streets had been cleared, and the town was bustling with activity. People stared as they rode past, and Juliana heard whispers following in their wake. "That is her, the one Zimmerman bought. I heard he paid $1,000. What is he doing with her? Nothing good, I would bet." Juliana felt her face burn with embarrassment, but Joshua's arm tightened around her reassuringly. "Ignore them," he said quietly. "They do not know anything." They stopped at the general store, and Joshua helped her down from the horse. Inside, the proprietor, a thin woman named Mrs. Walsh, looked up from her counter and gave them a disapproving stare. "Mr. Zimmerman," she said coldly, "what can I do for you?" "We need supplies," Joshua said, his voice even. "And Miss Morgan needs some proper clothes." Mrs. Walsh looked Juliana up and down with obvious judgment. "I see. Well, I suppose I can help with that." For the next hour, Juliana selected simple dresses, undergarments, shoes, and other necessities while Joshua gathered supplies. Mrs. Walsh was barely civil, making snide comments under her breath that Juliana tried to ignore when they were done. Joshua paid for everything without complaint, though Juliana knew it must have hurt to spend more money he could ill afford. They loaded the packages onto the horse and were about to leave when a voice stopped them. Well, if it is not the hero himself. They turned to find Marcus Gibbs standing behind them, flanked by two rough-looking men. Marcus's face was twisted into an ugly sneer. "Gibbs," Joshua said flatly. "What do you want?" "Just wanted to get a look at what $1,000 buys these days," Marcus said, his eyes raking over Juliana in a way that made her skin crawl. "Though from what I hear, you have not gotten your money's worth yet. Too much of a gentleman, they say." "What happens in my home is none of your business," Joshua said. His voice was calm, but Juliana could see the tension in his shoulders. "Oh, I think it is my business. See, you embarrassed me, Zimmerman, made me look like a fool in front of the whole town. That is the kind of thing that requires payback. I did not do anything to you. I simply outbid you. You drove the price up out of spite, then freed her like some kind of saint." Marcus spat in the snow. "All to make the rest of us look bad. You did not need my help for that." Marcus's face darkened and he took a step forward. His two friends moved with him, surrounding Joshua and Juliana. Other people on the street were watching now, but no one moved to help. "I think you owe me an apology," Marcus said. "I think you can go to hell," Joshua replied. Marcus lunged, but Joshua was ready. He pushed Juliana behind him and met Marcus's rush, the two men grappling in the snow. Marcus's friends moved in and Juliana screamed for help, but the crowd just watched. Joshua managed to land a solid punch to Marcus's jaw, sending him stumbling back. But then the other two men grabbed Joshua's arms, holding him while Marcus advanced with murder in his eyes. "Stop!" Juliana shouted, but no one listened. Marcus drew back his fist, but before he could swing, a gunshot rang out. Everyone froze. "That is enough." Juliana looked over to see Sheriff Tom Baker standing on the porch of his office, his rifle pointed at the sky. "Break it up now," the sheriff ordered. "All of you." Marcus's friends released Joshua, and Marcus himself stepped back, though his eyes promised retribution. "This is not over, Zimmerman," he said. "It never is with men like you," Joshua replied, wiping blood from his split lip. The sheriff walked over, his expression stern. "Gibbs, you and your boys clear out, now." Marcus glared but obeyed, stalking away with his friends. The sheriff turned to Joshua. "You all right? I will live. Thanks for the intervention." The sheriff looked between Joshua and Juliana. "I heard what you did, Zimmerman. Buying her and freeing her. That was a decent thing, even if it was legally questionable." "Legally questionable," Joshua said incredulously. "Henderson could argue you destroyed legal property when you tore up that contract. But seeing as how I think the whole system is rotten, I am choosing to look the other way." The sheriff tipped his hat. "You two best head home before Gibbs decides to come back with more men. They did not need to be told twice." Joshua helped Juliana back onto the horse, and they left Fort Smith at a gallop. By the time they reached the ranch, Joshua's lip had swollen, and there was a bruise forming on his cheek. Juliana insisted on tending to his wounds, and he sat patiently while she cleaned the cut with water and whiskey. "You should not have provoked him," she said as she worked. "He was going to be provoked no matter what I said. Men like Marcus do not need a reason to be angry. He could have really hurt you, but he did not." Joshua caught her hand as she reached for more bandages. "I am fine, Juliana." Their faces were close, and she could see flecks of gold in his gray eyes. Her breath caught in her throat. "You keep protecting me," she said softly, "fighting for me. Why? Because you deserve to be protected. You deserve to be fought for." His thumb brushed across her knuckles. "Because in the short time I have known you, you have become important to me." "Joshua." She started, but he pulled away, standing up abruptly. "It is getting dark. I should go tend the animals." He was gone before she could respond, leaving her standing alone in the cabin with her heart racing and her mind whirling. That night, they were both quiet during dinner, the easy camaraderie of the past week replaced by an awkward tension. Juliana wanted to say something, to address what had almost happened, but she did not know where to start. Finally, as she was cleaning up the dishes, Joshua spoke. "I am sorry if I made you uncomfortable earlier." She turned to look at him. "You did not. I overstepped. You are a guest in my home, and I should not have said what I said. What if I am glad you said it?" The words were out before she could stop them. Joshua stared at her. "Juliana." "I have feelings for you, Joshua," she said, her heart pounding. "I know I should not. I know it is complicated, but I cannot help it. You saved me. You gave me my freedom. You treat me with kindness and respect. How could I not fall for you?" "You do not know me," Joshua said, but there was longing in his voice. "Not really. We have known each other less than 2 weeks. I know enough. I know you are good and brave and principled. I know you make me feel safe. I know that when I am with you, I am happy." She crossed the room to stand in front of him. "Tell me you do not feel it too." "Of course I feel it," Joshua said, his voice rough. "From the moment I saw you on that platform, something inside me just knew. But this is not right, Juliana. You are vulnerable. You are dependent on me for shelter and food. If we became involved, it would put you in a position where you might feel obligated." "I would not feel obligated. I would feel chosen." She reached up and touched his face, tracing the bruise Marcus had left. "You said I belong to myself now. That means I get to choose what I want. And I choose you." Joshua closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. "You could have anyone. I do not want anyone, I want you. He opened his eyes and looked at her with such intensity that she felt it in her bones. Then, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned down and kissed her. It was gentle and tentative, a question more than a demand. Juliana answered by wrapping her arms around his neck and kissing him back with all the emotion she had been holding in for days. Joshua's arms came around her, pulling her close, and the kiss deepened. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Joshua rested his forehead against hers. "I am falling in love with you," he said quietly. "I have been since the day I met you, but I need you to be sure about this, Juliana. I need you to be absolutely certain this is what you want." "I have never been more certain of anything in my life," she said. He kissed her again, and this time there was no hesitation, no holding back. It was a kiss full of promise and passion, a seal on the connection that had been building between them since that cold day in Fort Smith. When they finally pulled apart, Joshua led her to sit by the fire. They talked long into the night, sharing dreams and fears and plans for the future. Juliana told him about her hope of one day opening a school for children whose families could not afford tutors. Joshua told her about his dream of building a ranch big enough to provide employment for people who needed a fresh start. "We could do it together," Juliana said. "Build something good, help people." "I would like that," Joshua said, threading his fingers through hers. "I would like that very much." They fell asleep in front of the fire, wrapped in each other's arms, and for the first time in her life, Juliana felt completely and utterly content. The next few weeks passed in a blur of happiness. Joshua and Juliana grew closer every day, their relationship deepening from attraction to genuine love. They worked side by side on the ranch, Joshua teaching Juliana how to care for the animals while she taught him finer points of cooking and household management. In the evenings, they read together or talked by the fire, sharing their pasts and dreaming about their future. Joshua was courting her properly now, treating her with a respect and tenderness that made her fall more in love with him every day. But their happiness could not last untouched. Word had spread through Fort Smith about their relationship, and opinions were divided. Some people, like Sheriff Baker and the preacher's wife, thought it was romantic. Others, like Mrs. Walsh and her circle, thought it was scandalous, and Marcus Gibbs thought it was an insult. One evening in late January, Joshua came back from checking the fence line with a troubled expression. "What is wrong?" Juliana asked immediately. "Someone cut the fence on the north pasture. 3 of my cattle are missing. Could it have been coyotes? Coyotes do not use wire cutters." Joshua's jaw was tight. This was deliberate. "Marcus, probably, or Dutch, or any of a dozen men who think I need to be taught a lesson." He ran a hand through his hair. "I should have known they would not let this go." Over the next week, more incidents occurred. A fire in the barn that Joshua caught just in time. Supplies stolen from the shed. One of the horses let loose in the middle of the night. Each incident was small enough to be deniable but clearly intentional. Juliana could see the stress wearing on Joshua, could see the tension in his shoulders and the worry in his eyes. She felt guilty, knowing this was happening because of her. "Maybe I should leave," she said one night. "Go somewhere else, somewhere far from Fort Smith." "Then they would leave you alone." "No," Joshua said firmly, "that is not happening. You are not being driven away by bullies and cowards. But they are destroying everything you have worked for. They are trying to. There is a difference." He pulled her into his arms. "I will not let them win, Juliana. I will not let them take you from me." The situation came to a head in early February. Joshua had gone into town to report the harassment to Sheriff Baker, leaving Juliana alone at the ranch. She was in the cabin preparing dinner when she heard horses outside. She looked out the window and felt her blood run cold. Dutch Van Horn and 3 of his ranch hands were dismounting in the yard. Juliana grabbed Joshua's rifle from over the fireplace and positioned herself by the door. When Dutch knocked, she called out, "What do you want?" "Just to talk, miss," Dutch said, his voice oily. "Open up. No, say what you have to say from out there." "Now, that is not very hospitable. We just want to make you an offer." "I am not interested." "You have not heard it yet." Dutch's voice hardened. "See, we have been thinking. Zimmerman paid $1,000 for you. We figure you must be worth at least that much. So we are willing to pay him back his money and take you off his hands." Juliana felt rage boil up inside her. "I am not for sale. Everything is for sale at the right price. We are prepared to go as high as $1,500. Get off this property, now, or what? You are going to shoot us." Dutch laughed. "You do not have it in you, girl." Juliana cocked the rifle, the sound loud in the still air. "Try me." There was a moment of tense silence. Then Dutch said, "You are making a mistake. Zimmerman cannot protect you forever. One of these days he is going to be gone, and then where will you be? If you lay one hand on this woman, I will kill you myself." Everyone turned to see Joshua riding into the yard, his own rifle drawn. Sheriff Baker was with him, along with 2 deputies. "This is private property, Van Horn," the sheriff said, "and you are trespassing. I suggest you and your boys mount up and head out before I arrest you all." Dutch glared at Joshua with pure hatred. "This is not over." "Yes, it is," Joshua said. "Because if you or any of your friends come near my ranch or Juliana again, I will press charges. The sheriff has already taken statements about all the harassment. You are 1 incident away from jail time. Is that clear?" Dutch spat in the snow but mounted his horse. He and his men rode off, and Juliana finally allowed herself to breathe. Joshua dismounted and hurried to the cabin, pulling her into his arms. "Are you all right?" "I am now," she said, clinging to him. "But Joshua, this has to stop. They are never going to leave us alone." "Actually, they might," Sheriff Baker said, walking over. "I had a talk with Marcus Gibbs and a few of the other troublemakers, made it clear that any more incidents would result in arrests and prosecutions. They are not happy about it, but they know I mean business." He tipped his hat. "You two should have some peace now." "Thank you, Sheriff," Joshua said. "We appreciate it." After the sheriff and his men left, Joshua and Juliana went inside. She was shaking with delayed reaction, and he held her while she cried out her fear and frustration. "I hate this," she said. "I hate that they think they can just take what they want, that they see me as property to be bought and sold." "I know. But you are not property, Juliana. You are a free woman, and I will spend the rest of my life making sure you stay that way." He pulled back to look at her. "In fact, I have been thinking about that." "About what?" Joshua took a deep breath. "About making sure you are legally protected, about making sure no one can ever try to claim ownership of you again." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. "About asking you to marry me." Juliana stared at the box, her heart pounding. "Joshua, I know it has only been a few months, I know this is fast, but I love you, Juliana. I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. And I want to spend the rest of my life with you, building a life together, protecting each other, being partners in every sense of the word." He opened the box to reveal a simple gold band. "Will you marry me?" Tears streamed down Juliana's face, but this time they were tears of joy. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." Joshua slipped the ring onto her finger and kissed her deeply. When they broke apart, both were grinning like fools. "How soon can we do this?" Juliana asked. "As soon as you want. Tomorrow, if you like," she laughed. "Let us give it at least a week." "I want to have a proper dress, and you need to look presentable." "I always look presentable," Joshua protested. "You look like a cowboy, a handsome cowboy, but still." She kissed him again. "I want this to be perfect." They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Fort Smith. The preacher's wife helped Juliana make a simple white dress, and Sheriff Baker stood up as Joshua's best man. A small crowd attended, divided between those who supported the match and those who came out of morbid curiosity. Marcus Gibbs and Dutch Van Horn did not attend, but Juliana saw them watching from across the street as she and Joshua left the church. She held her head high and her new husband's hand tight, refusing to let them spoil her happiness. The reception was held at the ranch, with neighbors and friends bringing food and well wishes. It was a simple affair, but to Juliana it was perfect. She danced with Joshua under the stars, surrounded by people who cared about them, and felt like the luckiest woman alive. That night, after all the guests had gone home, Joshua carried her over the threshold of the cabin. "Welcome home, Mrs. Zimmerman," he said, his eyes warm with love. "I have been home since the day you brought me here," Juliana replied. "I just did not realize it until now." They made love for the first time that night, a tender and passionate joining that sealed their commitment to each other. Afterward, lying in Joshua's arms, Juliana reflected on how much her life had changed in just a few months. She had started as a woman with no future, no hope, no control over her own destiny. Now she was a wife, a partner, a free woman who had chosen her own path, and it was all because of the man sleeping beside her, the man who had seen her worth when no one else did. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. Joshua stirred and pulled her closer. "I love you too, always." Spring came to Arkansas, bringing warm weather and new life. Joshua and Juliana worked together to plant a large garden, and Juliana began talking about her dream of starting a school. Joshua encouraged her, helping her draw up plans and figure out how they could afford to build a small schoolhouse on their property. "We could start with just a few students," Juliana said excitedly. "Children from families who cannot afford to send them into town for schooling. I could teach them reading, writing, and arithmetic. And I could teach them practical skills," Joshua added. "Woodworking, animal husbandry, how to survive on the land. We would be giving them a real chance at a better life, just like someone gave us." They smiled at each other, the shared dream binding them even closer together. In May, Juliana discovered she was pregnant. She told Joshua one evening after dinner, and the joy on his face made her cry happy tears. "We are going to be parents," he said wonderingly, his hand on her still flat stomach. "I am going to be a father." "You are going to be a wonderful father," Juliana said. "Loving and kind and patient, just like you are with me. And you will be an amazing mother. Our children will be so lucky." They spent that evening making plans, talking about names and nurseries and all the things they would teach their child. Juliana had never seen Joshua so animated, and it made her fall in love with him all over again. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and by fall, Juliana was gloriously round and glowing with health. Joshua was attentive and protective, constantly making sure she did not overwork herself. He had taken over most of her chores around the ranch, insisting that she focus on growing their baby. In late November, almost exactly 1 year after that fateful day in Fort Smith, Juliana went into labor. Joshua rode for the midwife, Mrs. Patterson, who arrived just in time to help deliver a healthy baby boy. Joshua held his son for the first time with tears streaming down his face. "He is perfect," he whispered. "Absolutely perfect." "What should we name him?" Juliana asked, exhausted but happy. They had discussed names, but nothing had felt quite right. Now, looking at their son, Joshua said, "What about Thomas, after your brother?" Juliana felt her throat tighten with emotion. "You would do that, of course. He was important to you. I want our son to carry his name." "Thomas Zimmerman," Juliana said, testing it out. "I love it. Little Thomas was a good baby, healthy and happy." He had Joshua's gray eyes and Juliana's dark hair, and both parents were completely besotted with him. Joshua proved to be every bit the devoted father Juliana had known he would be, spending hours rocking Thomas to sleep or playing with him on the floor of the cabin. Watching her husband with their son, Juliana sometimes had to pinch herself to believe this was her life. Just over a year ago, she had been standing on an auction platform, believing her life was over. Now she had a loving husband, a beautiful child, and a home filled with warmth and laughter. One evening, when Thomas was about 6 months old, Juliana and Joshua sat on the porch watching the sunset while their son slept inside. "Do you ever think about that day?" Juliana asked. "The day you bought me," sometimes, Joshua admitted. "I think about how close you came to being sold to someone who would have hurt you. It terrifies me." "I think about it differently," Juliana said. "I think about how lucky I was that you were there, that you were the kind of man who would sacrifice everything to do what was right." She took his hand. "You saved me, Joshua, not just from Marcus Gibbs or Dutch Van Horn, but from a life without hope. You gave me my freedom, and then you gave me your love. You gave me everything." "You gave me everything too," Joshua said. "Before I met you, I was just existing. Going through the motions, working toward goals that did not really matter. But you gave me purpose. You gave me a reason to build something meaningful. You gave me a family." He kissed her softly. "I would pay that $1,000 1,000,000 times over for the chance to love you." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars come out. Inside, Thomas stirred and made a small sound, and Juliana started to rise, but Joshua stopped her. "I will get him," he said. "You rest." She watched him go inside and heard him talking softly to their son, his deep voice soothing. A moment later, he returned with Thomas in his arms, and they sat together as a family, rocking gently in the evening breeze. As the months turned into years, the Zimmerman ranch prospered. Joshua's cattle operation grew, and with careful management and Juliana's business sense, they were able to save money and expand their holdings. True to their dreams, they built a small schoolhouse on their property, and Juliana began teaching children from the surrounding farms. The school started with just 5 students, but grew quickly as word spread about Juliana's skill as a teacher. She had a gift for making learning exciting and accessible, and her students adored her. Joshua helped by teaching practical skills in the afternoons, and together they created a unique educational experience that prepared children for real life in Arkansas. Thomas grew into a bright, curious boy who loved both his parents equally. He would spend mornings helping Juliana in the school, soaking up knowledge like a sponge, and afternoons following Joshua around the ranch, learning to ride and rope and care for animals. When Thomas was 3, Juliana gave birth to twin girls, Sarah and Rebecca. Joshua was over the moon with his daughters, doting on them shamelessly. The cabin became too small for their growing family, so Joshua built an addition, adding 2 more bedrooms and expanding the main living area. Life was not always easy. There were hard winters and dry summers, sick animals and failed crops. Money was sometimes tight, and there were days when both Joshua and Juliana fell into bed exhausted from the work of running a ranch, a school, and raising 3 children. But they were happy. Truly, deeply happy in a way that came from building a life together based on love and mutual respect. One evening, when the children were all asleep, Juliana and Joshua sat by the fire like they had done so many times before. "You remember what you said to me?" Juliana asked. "That first day." Joshua smiled. "I said a lot of things that first day. You said now you belong to yourself." Juliana moved closer to him. "It was the most powerful thing anyone had ever said to me. In that moment, you gave me back my own life. You belonged to yourself all along, Joshua said. I just made it legal. No, it was more than that. You showed me that I had value, that my freedom mattered, that I deserved to make my own choices. She took his hand. You taught me what love should look like. Not ownership, not control, but partnership and respect and choosing each other every single day. You taught me the same thing, Joshua said. You taught me that being strong does not mean being hard, that protecting someone does not mean controlling them, that real love means supporting someone's freedom, not limiting it. They kissed, and it was as sweet and full of promise as their first kiss had been years ago. I choose you, Juliana whispered. Today and every day. For the rest of my life I choose you. And I choose you, Joshua replied. Always and forever. The years continued to pass, bringing more changes and more blessings. The school grew until Juliana had to hire another teacher to help her. The ranch expanded until Joshua employed several ranch hands. Thomas grew into a fine young man who decided to go to college to study law, determined to change the unjust systems his parents had taught him to recognize. Sarah became a teacher like her mother, and Rebecca followed her father into ranching. Juliana and Joshua grew older together, their love deepening with each passing year. They built a life that mattered, that helped people, that made a real difference in their community. The story of how they met became legendary in Fort Smith, a tale told to young people as an example of courage and conviction. Marcus Gibbs and Dutch Van Horn both eventually moved away from Fort Smith, their influence waning as the town grew and changed. Sheriff Baker served for many more years before retiring, always proud of the role he had played in protecting the Zimmermans. The small ranch that Joshua had bought with his hard-earned savings became one of the most successful in Arkansas, known for its fair treatment of workers and its high-quality cattle. The school became a fixture of the community, providing education to hundreds of children over the decades. But the real legacy Joshua and Juliana left was not the ranch or the school. It was the example of their love, a love built on freedom and respect, on choosing each other every single day, on standing up for what was right even when it was hard. On their 25th wedding anniversary, the whole town of Fort Smith threw them a celebration. The preacher gave a speech about their enduring love, and Sheriff Baker, now retired but still spry, toasted them as the finest couple he had ever known. As they danced together under the stars, just as they had on their wedding night, Juliana looked up at her husband and saw the same love in his eyes that had been there from the very beginning. "You have any regrets?" she asked. "About spending that $1,000? About tearing up those papers?" Joshua laughed and pulled her closer. "Not even for a second. That $1,000 bought me the greatest treasure I could ever have. Your love and a life with you. That is worth more than all the money in the world. I love you, Joshua Zimmerman." "I love you too, Juliana Zimmerman, for the rest of my life and beyond." They continued to dance, surrounded by their children and grandchildren, by friends and neighbors, by a community they had helped build. And as the music played and the stars shone overhead, they both knew with absolute certainty that they had been blessed beyond measure. Juliana thought back to that cold day in winter when she had stood on the auction platform, believing her life was over. She thought about the moment Joshua had torn up those papers and said those powerful words, "Now you belong to yourself." He had given her freedom, and in return, she had freely given him her heart. Together, they had built something beautiful and lasting, a love story that would be remembered for generations. As they grew older still, Joshua and Juliana settled into a comfortable rhythm. They turned the daily management of the ranch over to Rebecca and her husband, and Sarah took over running the school. Thomas, now a successful lawyer, worked to change laws that oppressed women and the poor, carrying on his parents' legacy of fighting injustice. Joshua and Juliana spent their days together, taking slow walks around the property, reading to their grandchildren, and simply enjoying each other's company. Their love had not dimmed with age. If anything, it had grown stronger, tempered by decades of shared joys and sorrows. One evening in late autumn, nearly 40 years after that fateful day in Fort Smith, they sat together on the porch watching the sunset. Joshua's hair was gray now, and Juliana's face was lined with age, but they still held hands like young lovers. "It has been a good life," Joshua said quietly. "The best life," Juliana agreed. "I would not change a single thing. Not even the hard parts, especially not the hard parts. They made us who we are. They taught us what really matters." Joshua squeezed her hand. "You are what really matters. You always have been. From the moment I saw you on that platform, you were the most important thing in my world." "You saved me," Juliana said, tears in her eyes. "No," Joshua said firmly. "I just gave you the chance to save yourself. Everything you became, everything you achieved, that was all you. I just had the privilege of standing beside you while you did it." They sat in silence as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. In the distance, they could hear their grandchildren playing, their laughter ringing out in the evening air. "Do you think we made a difference?" Juliana asked. "Do you think our lives mattered?" Joshua gestured to the schoolhouse where another generation of children was learning to read and think and dream. He pointed to the ranch where workers were treated fairly and paid well. He nodded toward their children and grandchildren, all of them raised with values of justice and compassion. "I think we made more of a difference than we will ever know," he said. "We changed lives, Juliana, starting with our own and rippling outward to touch hundreds of others. That matters. That will always matter." As the stars began to appear overhead, the same stars that had shone on their wedding night all those years ago, Juliana leaned her head on Joshua's shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For seeing me when no one else did, for valuing my freedom, for loving me enough to let me choose you, for building this beautiful life with me." "Thank you for choosing me," Joshua replied. "Thank you for your courage and your strength and your love. Thank you for making every single day an adventure. Thank you for being you." They sat together as the night deepened. Two souls who had found each other against all odds, who had built a love story that would echo through generations. And as they held each other under the vast Arkansas sky, they both knew that their love was eternal, a force that would outlast their mortal bodies and live on in the lives they had touched and the legacy they had built. Years later, when both had passed peacefully, surrounded by children and grandchildren who loved them deeply, the people of Fort Smith erected a plaque in the town square. It told the story of Joshua Zimmerman, who had paid $1,000 for a woman's freedom, and Juliana Morgan Zimmerman, who had used that freedom to build a better world. But the real memorial to their love was not made of brass and stone. It was in the school that still educated children, in the ranch that still treated workers with dignity, in the laws that Thomas had helped change, in the teachers Sarah had trained, in the land Rebecca had carefully stewarded. It was in the stories told by their descendants, stories of courage and conviction, of standing up for what is right, of the transformative power of real love. And on cold winter days, when the wind howled through Fort Smith, old-timers would sometimes tell young people about the coldest day of winter in 1876, when a young woman named Juliana Morgan stood on an auction platform, and a cowboy named Joshua Zimmerman paid everything he had to set her free. They would talk about how he tore up the papers and said, "Now you belong to yourself." And they would tell how that single act of courage and compassion had changed not just two lives, but an entire community. Because that is what love does. Real love, the kind built on freedom and respect and daily choices. It does not just change the people who experience it. It radiates outward, touching everyone it encounters, making the world a little bit better, a little bit brighter, a little bit more just. And so the story of Joshua and Juliana lived on, a reminder that one person can make a difference, that love is stronger than greed, that freedom is worth any price, and that the best stories do not end with, happily, ever after. They end with, and they made the world better for having loved each other. The Zimmerman family continued to grow and prosper for generations, but they never forgot where they came from. Every year on the anniversary of Joshua and Juliana's first meeting, the family gathered at the original homestead to celebrate not just their ancestors' love, but the values they had embodied: courage, compassion, justice, and the fundamental belief that every human being deserves to belong to themselves. And in that way, Joshua and Juliana's love story never really ended. It lived on in every act of kindness, every stand taken against injustice, every person who chose love over control, freedom over ownership, partnership over dominion. It lived on in the hearts of everyone who heard their story and decided to be a little bit braver, a little bit kinder, a little bit more willing to sacrifice for what is right. And it will live on as long as there are people who believe that love should set you free, not bind you. That real strength comes from lifting others up, not holding them down. That the most powerful words you can say to another human being are not "you belong to me," but "you belong to yourself." This was the legacy of Joshua and Juliana Zimmerman. This was the story that began on the coldest day of winter, when a cowboy paid everything he had and gave a woman her freedom. When he showed her through his actions that she mattered, that her life had value, that she deserved to make her own choices. And this was the story that continues still, whispered in the wind that blows across the Arkansas plains, etched in the stones of the school that still stands, carried in the hearts of everyone who believes that love and justice can change the world. Because they can. They did. And they will again, as long as there are people brave enough to stand up and say, as Joshua Zimmerman once did on a cold winter day in 1876, "Now you belong to yourself." Those 6 words changed everything. They were a declaration of independence, a recognition of humanity, an act of love so profound that it echoed through time, and in the end, that is what love really is. Not ownership, not possession, not control, but freedom. The freedom to choose to grow to become who you are meant to be. The freedom to love freely because you want to, not because you have to. That is what Joshua gave Juliana. And that is what Juliana gave back to Joshua. And together, they gave it to their children, their students, their community, and everyone who heard their story. They gave the world an example of what love could and should be. And the world was better for it. So the story ends where it began, with a woman standing in the cold and a man making a choice. But this time, the woman is not alone and afraid. She is surrounded by descendants who carry her strength, by a community that remembers her courage, by a legacy of love that will never die. And the man is not just a cowboy with $1,000 burning a hole in his pocket. He is a symbol of what it means to be truly good, to sacrifice for others, to see the humanity in every person and fight to protect it. Together, they were more than just 2 people who fell in love. They were a revolution in miniature, a quiet rebellion against systems of oppression, a living testament to the power of choosing love and freedom over everything else. And that is why their story matters. Not because it is unusual for a love story to have a happy ending, but because it shows us what a happy ending really looks like. Not perfection, not ease, but two people choosing each other and choosing freedom every single day, building something beautiful together, leaving the world better than they found it. That is the true happily ever after. That is the legacy of Joshua and Juliana Zimmerman. That is the story that began on the coldest day of winter and will warm hearts for generations to come, because some love stories are just stories. But others, the special ones, the ones that really matter, are blueprints. They show us not just what is, but what could be, what should be, what we can make happen if we are brave enough, kind enough, strong enough to follow their example. The story of the cowboy who paid for a woman's freedom and then gave it to her is one of those stories. It is a reminder that we always have a choice. We can choose cruelty or kindness, control or freedom, selfishness or sacrifice. Joshua chose kindness, freedom, and sacrifice. Juliana chose courage, resilience, and love. Together they chose to build a life that mattered, and because they did, their story lives on. Not just in history books or family legends, but in every act of compassion, every stand for justice, every relationship built on mutual respect and true partnership. Their story lives on in you if you choose to let it. If you choose to see people as people, not property. If you choose to lift others up instead of holding them down. If you choose to believe that love means freedom and freedom means choice and choice means everything, so choose well. Choose bravely. Choose love. And maybe, just maybe, your story will be remembered too. Not because you were famous or powerful or rich, but because you made a difference. Because you stood up for what was right when it was hard. Because you loved someone well and true. Because you left the world a little bit better than you found it. Just like Joshua and Juliana Zimmerman did on a cold winter day in Fort Smith, Arkansas, in 1876, when everything changed because one man looked at a woman on an auction platform and decided that her freedom mattered more than his money, more than public opinion, more than anything else in the world. That is love. Real, true, transformative love. And that is how the story ends, with love winning, with freedom triumphing, with two people who belong to themselves choosing to belong to each other. With a legacy that will never die as long as there are people who believe that every human being deserves dignity, respect, and the right to determine their own destiny. The end.